and welcome back to Book and Page. I swear I say hello more and more like a cartoon every day. Hello! We are pushing our way through the end times of the Place of the Lion. We are on chapter 12 today, The Triumph of the Angelicals. And I like this chapter. I like this chapter because I honestly feel it achieves what prior chapters were trying to articulate, but without it being so just gosh darn offensive towards the female variety. I mean, it's a little bit, which is going to happen oftentimes when you do have a female in the role of bad guy here, getting their full comeuppance. But we'll talk about that as we get to it. We definitely need the summary for me to articulate all of this today, because what happens here, like I said, is like a microcosm of what's happened in previous chapters, happening with a different character. This chapter actually follows Richardson, so the assistant that still works at the bookshop, if the bookshop and Richardson survive all this. And he was last left when Anthony went riding off after Damaris on the back of the ideal horse. And Richardson is kind of a little bit like, what did I just see? And rather than going home, he starts to wander as he contemplates on all of this. And we get this short little information nugget that tells us that he is, and I've mentioned these ways before, via negativa. He is a firm believer in the way of negation, which is strip everything away, and that's how you will find your way to God or enlightenment or ascension or whatever you want to call it. Because in comparison to via negativa, there is via affirmativa, which is to say everything around us leads us to that end. This is most often used in religious terms, and via negativa is for sure the more strident one, simply because you do have groups that will take this to the ultimate extreme of fully removing everything from themselves, which is to say that even things like clothing and food are part of the material world, not part of the spiritual world, and thus block your spiritual movement. And there are groups who, for example, have buried themselves alive without food and very little water. And ultimately, I mean, there are groups that actually do this and they provide, it's living mummification. They do this in a system that will mummify the bodies, and they become then spiritual icons of via negativa. This is as how you can ascend in that realm. And this is not just not Christianity. There are accounts of this in Christianity. For example, monks or nuns or people who have had direct contact with God who do things like go on full hunger strikes and fasts and ultimately die that way. There are accounts of them bricking themselves into rooms. That is to say, having their congregation brick them into a room. And it's the exact same thing, right? It's this idea that strip everything else away and you will find what leads you to God. Richardson admits that this is sort of the way that he's going about it, but he's not to the other extreme. So it's sort of an interesting one where it's via negativa, but not to the full degree that some people are going to say you have to get to for the way of negation to actually work. But this is a very brief moment where he sort of realizes, he comes back to himself, and he's in the poorer part of town. Which we've already been told by a lot of these characters, that the poor people are poor. And stupid. And this is sort of actually a redemption moment, because I think Richardson learns a lot from this. So first he has a conversation with a tobacconist who's shutting down his shop, who informs him that something's actually destroyed a bunch of the telephone poles and lines. And Richardson says, like, that's really concerning if it comes to houses. And they have this back and forth about whether or not humans inhabiting the houses can help prevent this. We'll get to it. After this conversation, Richardson is about to continue on when he notices a local church. It's a little small, ugly thing that is very traditional in its views. It still calls itself a Zion. It still has a breaking of the bread ceremony rather than communion. And he notices that this evening breaking of the bread is happening. And as he approaches the church, he has a vision of the divine unicorn, so another one of the ideals has come into the world and seems to be tending to this breaking of the bread. And Richardson is just drawn towards this unicorn and is accosted by Mr. Foster, who is almost completely gone to the lion now, who is literally muttering about hunting down somebody. We can probably assume it's Anthony, because he says that the man was in his quarters. And he's going to provide a blood sacrifice. This actually gets Richardson heated, and he replies that there is only one true sacrifice, and the God of Gods makes that sacrifice. Between Richardson's outburst and Foster's strange behavior, this does draw a crowd, including all of those in the church, and an older couple does offer their home to Mr. Foster to recover from whatever illness is affecting him. Mr. Foster does actually run off after this, and Richardson sort of commends him to God. He says he's in God's hands now, and everyone kind of has to accept this. This moment, though, has made him wonder how Miss Wilmot is doing, so he actually goes and calls upon her, only to find that she too is almost completely gone to the snake, though she seems to be resisting it. The power is starting to scare her, but she's also spent her time writing these really poisonous letters about all her friends to each other. It's this awful moment that gets even more viscerally awful as the snake fully starts to try and take over her, and we can assume sort of rips her to pieces from the inside. Richardson does pass out, and he wakes up in the care of Dr. Rockbotham, who only tells us that it was awful and there will have to be a postmortem. So Miss Wilmot has died entirely to the snake in an extremely awful and painful way, and we end the chapter with Richardson sort of begging off that he's been through a lot and he would just like to go home. Yeah, there is a lot to talk about here, because boy oh boy do we have a lot of religious imagery, and the discussion, of course, via negativa versus via affirmativa is a hard one to parse out. Like I mentioned before, this is not a complete and total via negativa moment, considering that we saw Richardson in a bookshop rather than any type of religious setting where he could focus fully on the path that he's attempting to do. And he even tells us more starkly than that this is something that he is taking care of, as it were. Even his connection with Berenger had been but a part of a distraction necessary and right to relieve the rigor of his duty and to keep him in spiritual health, but not part of that duty. Chance, assisted by his personal taste, had given him a job among books, and as far as possible he read in those books of the many ways which there are always the way. That has a capital W, by the way. But not by books, or by phrases, not by images or symbols or myths, did he himself follow it. He abstracted himself continually from sense and from thought, attempting always a return to an interior nothingness, where that which itself no thing might communicate its sole essential being. So, we're told very directly that if Richardson were to have a philosophy, he would communicate it as via negativa, the way of negation. Abstract yourself from all of these things and return to the interior nothingness that will be the way. But he does have a life. And this is sort of an interesting one. It does, again, reach back to the Greek, and I love how much the Greek and the Christian religion are intermingling here. Aristotle actually talks about the fact that even if philosophy were the final goal of a person, the perfect life is the absolutely philosophical one, you can never achieve it perfectly because you're not self-sufficient. Which means you always have to eat, and you have to earn money so that you can eat. You have to have a building over your head. So for the common person, especially, this is not possible. And for a human being altogether, it's not possible. Though Aristotle does mention, of course, any divine beings would be able to achieve this because they would be self-sufficient. So in this case, God can achieve perfect via negativa. We can only ever get non-perfect forms, imperfect forms. And Richardson, most especially, because he himself isn't part of any religious sect that's going to help provide those necessary essentials without him having to do much about it. So he does have to work, he does have to eat, and he even says that he has to socialize. He socializes with the likes of Mr. Behringer because for his own health and safety, he seems to recognize that via negativa is going to be utterly decimating if he's not careful. And that seems to be true of practically everything. We're definitely seeing that with Foster and Wilmot. The idea that if you devote yourself so entirely to one single thing, if it's not the right thing, it will utterly destroy you. So for Foster, he's devoted himself to utter strength and power, but power without all these other virtues, and I think especially the unicorn, I'm going to come to the unicorn, is just power for power's sake, and it's blood for the blood god. It's him going, I will present you a bloody sacrifice, and Richardson going, no. The one sacrifice is the God of God's sacrifice, which of course, if we're going by New Testament Christianity, is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross to forgive all of our sins, including the original sin of Adam and Eve, which everyone is born with. So, bloody sacrifices, no go. At least New Testament-wise. There are going to be people who argue, especially if you know the Old Testament, different era. And Miss Wilmot has also sort of been subsumed into... I've never quite figured out what the snake is supposed to be. It sort of seems to be this knowledge, and it is then, if we want to connect to original sin and Adam and Eve forbidden knowledge. Because she has spent all her time writing these letters with information that is definitely wicked and poisonous, but it's a question of whether or not it's true. We're never given a sense of whether it is. But I will simply say that, again, there's a useful Greek story here, which is the 3 sieves of Socrates. I can't tell you where this has come from. I can't tell you if it's a modern invention of this account. I just find it a fascinating one, which is to say that Socrates is teaching a class when one of his students steps up and says that he has a story for Socrates. As he's about to tell it, Socrates actually interrupts him and asks him if he has passed the story through the 3 sieves. The first is truth. Do you know what is, in fact, true about this story? If it's just something you've overheard, you haven't confirmed the truth, then don't tell me about it, because you're just spreading rumors at that point in time, and it's not useful. Even if it's true, you should pass it through the second sieve, which is it good? Is what is going to become of this good? Is it going to help people? Is it going to make everyone feel good? If the answer is no, then don't do it. Then the third sieve is necessity. Sometimes the truth might not be good, but it might be necessary. For example, there's an army marching on us, and our army's been destroyed. That's not exactly a good thing, but if it's true, then it's definitely necessary for people to know this. So, you always want to know, before you go around talking about things, if it's true, if it's going to provide good outcomes, and if it's necessary, especially if it's not necessarily going to be good. These letters, we definitely don't get a sense of that. Even if, in fact, all of this is true, it's done in a very poisonous manner where we can tell that it's not for the good of anybody here. It's precisely out of wickedness that these letters are being written and being sent around. How do we know this? Miss Wilmot does not sign them. If this was both good and necessary and true, then Miss Wilmot would have signed those letters. You shouldn't be ashamed to tell somebody the truth, even if it's about something unfortunate, if it's ultimately going to be necessary for that person to know, and ultimately going to be a good outcome. You should do that in person, or at least admit to it, if that's what you're going to do. If you feel you need to hide in doing this, again, I'm not talking full black and white. There are definitely times where saying the truth is going to be damaging for you, and you might want to remain anonymous so that you don't die. But in this case, that is not what's happening. Miss Wilmot is not in fear of her life. She just wants to stir up some shit. So it's this forbidden knowledge and this wicked use of knowledge that seems to be happening here with the snake. So if we've got power, we've got knowledge, and again, seems to be the negative side of knowledge on that one. What then is the unicorn? We are told it is the divine unicorn. So capital D on divine there, unicorn. And the first time we perceive it, it is in the church during the breaking of the bread. Now, I have grappled with this one since studying this book in school. Very interestingly, I have nothing underlined in this chapter, which kind of tells me that my class also struggled with it quite a bit, considering the next few chapters have a good deal of underlining, which says that we dealt more with the fire and Quentin coming up than we did with the unicorn. So I'm proposing that the unicorn here, the divine unicorn, is the ideal form of service. What I mean by that is to say that service to your fellow humans is important. And is definitely not part of via negativa. But interestingly, we don't get a sense, in this chapter especially, that via negativa is in fact the right way, capital way, to God and these virtues. We are actually told this very directly at one point, right before Richardson goes off to see about Miss Wilmot. His own solitary life, Richardson speaking to himself, had rather left him without any formed a habit of being kind, he reflected. Perhaps he was a little too much inclined to concentrate on an end which was, and then in quotations, all the authorities assured him, end quotation, largely dependent on the way, lowercase w. Anthony Durant had gone charging off to some unknown Damaris. Berenger had been kind to him. Very well, he would go and see if the road of the unicorn led through the house of Dora Wilmot. So, Richardson is very directly connecting the unicorn here with his change in opinion. That his solitary nature to himself has left him lacking something in the world. And he has come upon this realization through a series of moments showing service to others. Anthony running off to help Damaris, the unicorn appearing in the church, and this moment where this old couple offers to help Foster to give him a place to rest. Mr. Foster is absolutely deranged at this point in time. He is talking about blood sacrifices, about hunting down and killing somebody. And these two older folks still look at him as a person who needs help. And this is why I like this chapter so much more than our previous chapters, especially with Anthony and Damaris, because this chapter articulates, I think, what Anthony was trying to say to Damaris when she admitted that she had pushed Quentin away. This is the type of service necessary. Service above and beyond what would normally be acceptable when a person honestly needs it. This older couple is showing Richardson, the readers, and Damaris, if she could see this, that sometimes you need to offer help to somebody, even if they frighten you. Damaris didn't understand that, and Anthony, frankly, is absolute shit at explaining these things. But Richardson, in this moment, understands, and while he finds that maybe he could articulate it better than the older woman does, it's enough to prompt him to realize something lacking in himself. He has never shown this kind of kindness and care to anybody else, really, despite the fact that it's been shown to him. Mr. Berenger was kind to him. So now he ultimately also has to serve somebody else. He has to go to Miss Wilmot and see if there is some way that he can help her, or at least, again, mitigate the damage done, which he does by removing the letters from play. Why does the unicorn in the church point to this, I feel? Well, because it's the breaking of the bread ceremony, also known as communion. This is the taking of the bread and wine, which is connected to the sacrifice and service of Jesus. At the Last Supper, Jesus held up bread and broke it, and said, "This is my body broken for you," and all the apostles at dinner shared that bread. He then held up a glass of wine and said, "This is my blood spilled for you," and they also shared that. This is actually a communion with the divine that has continued on even into this day, and many Christian faiths continue with this communion. You take the bread and wine as a recognition of God's sacrifice and service to humanity. But most people will also tell you it is a call to action yourself to go out and serve the community. Here there are people who attempt to serve the community by speaking to Richardson about his own faith, though they are seemingly the smarter type that when he says, "Yes, I have faith in my own way," they back down and don't get insistent. And of course the older couple offering their home to somebody that they have no idea who he is. He's acting extremely strange and possibly violent, but he's somebody who needs help. Service is done through humanity. The service that Jesus provided in his sacrifice wouldn't mean anything if none of us acted. There's a fairly well-known story about a man out lost at sea who calls to God for help. A ship arrives and offers to pull him in, but the man refuses, saying that God will provide for him. A second and third ship come along, but he answers in the same way. Finally, the man is at the end of his strength and calls out to God, "Why have you forsaken me?" To which God replies, "Forsaken you? My son, I sent you 3 ships." It's a question of whether or not you can see the service. It's not likely going to be the hand of God descending down from the heavens to help you. It's more likely going to be another human being, and maybe not even necessarily one of your own faith. The term Good Samaritan comes from the Bible. It's actually a group of people who were not of the Jewish or Christian religion. They were Samaritans who had their own religious faith, but still helped somebody on the road, despite the fact that this man was turned away from his own religious people. Be a good Samaritan. Serve somebody, even if it's not at the prompting of your own God. Do it because it's the right thing to do. It's necessary and true and good. It's the triumph of the Angelicals here in this moment, in the sense of service, which can be done even without faith. human beings can make all the difference. That's what the Tobacco Man was speaking about. He, of course, was looking at a much more material sense of that in creating a home. You put a single piece of furniture that says somebody lives here, and suddenly it's a different sense of the word. And different sense of the home. But humanity can serve each other, whether or not that service is connected to the divine beings or not. If you're only ever in service of yourself, such as Foster and Wilmot, you will only ultimately come to destruction. This is something that Richardson actually learns. He seems to have realized in this chapter that the via negativa that he was trying to follow was of a more selfish variety. He failed to ultimately learn to be kind until now. But that's also important. It proves a couple of things that, again, I don't think the earlier chapters have necessarily hit on properly. Which is to say, 1, you can get here through your own thought process. Good examples certainly help, but Richardson doesn't need someone standing there saying, you have failed to be kind and now you need to learn to do that, which is precisely what happens with Anthony and Damaris. There is, again, that growing concern. Can Richardson achieve this because he is a man, and Damaris needs somebody to outright tell her because she is a woman? The fact that we have these two different versions makes me suspect that a little more, but I much prefer the idea that you can get here logically if you're willing to look and listen and learn. It also tells us that the forms are not utter destructive beings bent on destroying anyone who is either too into them or not into them enough. Richardson is lacking something here, but the vision of the divine unicorn is enough to prompt him towards it. He is able to learn and not be destroyed here, because humans are imperfect. The fact that Anthony somehow becomes this perfect being is less communicative than Richardson learning he's made mistakes and trying to improve on it. I connect far more with Richardson and Damaris than I do with Anthony, because Anthony never seems to have these moments where he realizes that he was wrong in previous actions. His hypothesis might develop, but it's never been something quintessential about himself that he's needed to change and improve on, like Richardson and Damaris have. So ultimately, they're the more compelling characters. Richardson can see the divine unicorn and recognize where he's failed in life, but the divine unicorn, again, is saying that's okay, improve from here, and the world becomes a better place. I much prefer this chapter over practically anything else I've read up to this point, simply because the divine unicorn as a symbol of service is absolutely fascinating, because it sort of shuts down this idea that these divine forms are coming in to utterly destroy the world. If service is in fact an important thing, and service from humans to other humans is important, that tells us that divine beings, the angelicals, have a purpose here that is not the destruction or consuming of the human world. It is an interference with the idea of improving the human world. And that's why I think this chapter is actually called The Triumph of the Angelicals. We're not at the full end of it yet. You figure the Triumph of the Angelicals would in fact be the last chapter of the book. But it's happening at chapter 12 as Richardson realizes that service is important. Service to your fellow man is a far stronger way to any religious and divine understanding or spiritual understanding than via negativa ever was for him. I think when you get this philosophically and spiritually just packed, trying to unpack it a little bit tends to lead just to a can of words opening, and boom, suddenly you got fish and worms everywhere. So, I'm going to keep reading. We are going to switch back to the fire that we perceived earlier on the next chapter, and then we'll have to deal with Quentin. So, like I said, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.